What would happen if the sun disappeared? If our star suddenly went out, we wouldn't just be plunged into darkness. We would also experience an ice age and widespread famine. But what if the sun just took a really long vacation? What if it randomly stopped shining for several months? In this video, we are going to find out what would happen if the sun disappeared for 18 months. But first, let's look at a similar event that happened on Earth thousands of years ago. People go about their daily routines, unaware that things are about to change drastically. People struggle to carry on with their lives as normal, but the unusual darkness makes it difficult to work or even sleep. Crops begin to wither and die, and people are forced to ration their food supplies. Fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire as people try to make sense of what's happening. One is that a massive volcano erupted somewhere on Earth, spewing ash and gas into the atmosphere. The ash blocked the sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet, but we don't know of any volcanoes that erupted around that time. Another theory is that a large comet or asteroid hit the Earth. Again, there is no evidence of an impact during that time period. However, in many places food was scarce and people had to ration what they had. It's unclear exactly how many people died during this time, but it's estimated that millions starved to death in Europe and Asia. The impact of the climate shift was so severe that it's been given a name, the Dark Ages Cold Episode. This event had far-reaching consequences and had a major impact on human history. The sudden change in climate led to widespread crop failures, famine, and death. It also contributed to the fall of empires and the rise of new civilizations. The Dark Ages Cold Episode was a pivotal moment in human history and had a profound impact on the course of civilization. Some people turned to eating their animals for food, but this led to a shortage of working animals and made it even more difficult to grow crops the following year. For starters, we wouldn't be able to rely on eyewitness accounts to tell our story. Most of us are so reliant on technology that we probably wouldn't even notice what was happening. Then, when we realized the sun had disappeared, there would be total chaos. Food shortages and mass panic would ensue. The world would enter a state of anarchy, and the chances of survival would be slim to none. As the cold weather continued, people began to weaken from lack of nutrition and exposure to the elements. Some developed frostbite or hypothermia, and others became ill from eating spoiled food. The cold weather lasted for several years, and people had to endure freezing temperatures, blizzards, and frozen ground. They struggled to keep warm and dry, and many died from exposure or illness. A third theory is that there was a massive decline in solar activity. Our sun goes through cycles of high and low activity. During periods of low activity, fewer sunspots and solar flares are observed, which could explain why the sun seemed to dim. But there is one more theory that may be the most intriguing of all. Some believe it's a punishment from the gods, while others blame it on the actions of a vengeful sorcerer. Perhaps there was a huge forest fire or a series of fires that raged across the northern hemisphere, blocking out the sun. We may never know for sure what caused this strange event, but it serves as a reminder of how fragile our planet is. Even a small change in temperature can have devastating consequences. The situation becomes increasingly desperate as people's health begins to suffer due to lack of sunlight and vitamin deficiencies. But the effects weren't limited to just Europe. In fact, the entire northern hemisphere experienced a sudden and dramatic climate shift. And in England, people had to abandon their homes and seek shelter in caves and forests. Animals also suffered during this time. Many died from exposure or starvation, and those that survived had to find new ways to find food. The sudden change in climate caught people off guard, and they didn't have the necessary supplies to cope with the harsh conditions. People who lived in colder climates were particularly affected as they weren't used to such extreme temperatures. Those who lived in warmer climates were better prepared for the cold weather, but they too suffered greatly. The sudden drop in temperature caused widespread crop failures and livestock deaths. The temperature dropped so low that rivers froze and people were able to walk across them. Snow fell in the middle of summer and crops withered and died. In some places, it snowed so heavily that villages were buried under several feet of snow. People struggled to survive in the freezing conditions and many lost their lives. The once vibrant community is now shrouded in fear and despair. One day, people notice that the brightness of the sun seems to diminish and its light begins to flicker. It looks like the end of the world is happening right before their eyes. A strange mist starts covering the face of the sun, blocking its light. People panic as they watch this eerie sight unfold before them. They wonder what could be causing this strange phenomenon and what it means for their future. In 536 AD, the sun stopped shining, and no one knew why. How could such an event have affected the entire planet? People emerge from their homes, blinking in the sudden brightness. They cautiously go about their day, still unsure of what to expect next. As the weeks pass, life slowly begins to return to normal, and people begin to rebuild their lives. However, the impact of the darkened sun never truly leaves them. They are forever changed by the experience and wary of what the future may hold. By studying tree rings, scientists can determine the average temperature for each year going back thousands of years. They found that in the year 536, the temperature suddenly dropped by about 2.5 degrees Celsius. This may not sound like much, but keep in mind that it's equivalent to an atom bomb explosion. But instead of happening in an instant, this temperature drop occurred gradually over several years. The renowned Byzantine historian Procopius described what he witnessed during this. The year is 536, a day the sun is shining brightly in the sky. As days turn into weeks, the mist thickens and the sun's light becomes dimmer and dimmer. But after 18 long months, the fog finally lifts and the sun shines brightly once again. But was the sun really covered by fog? That doesn't sound very likely, does it? But what could have caused such a drastic change in temperature? Scientists have a few theories. It is possible that a massive amount of smoke and particulates were released into the atmosphere by human activity. And indeed, the temperature drop in 536 had a profound impact on the world around it. For example, in the city of Troyes, France, a church collapsed because of the heavy snowfall. In some areas, people were able to store enough food to last through the winter. This wasn't just a local event. In fact, it's believed that the temperature drop affected the entire northern hemisphere and lasted for 18 months. If something like this were to happen again today, the consequences would be even more disastrous. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out my other content where I explore the mysteries of our universe. See you next time. 2,000 years ago, in the year 544 AD, an intense cold period struck across the northern hemisphere. While it lasted, crop failures, famine, and disease swept across the continent and populations fell drastically. What caused this dramatic event? Well, it took 1,500 years for us to uncover the real cause of the darkness. In 2014, a team of scientists drilled through over 3 kilometers of ice in central Greenland to extract a cylindrical block of ancient ice known as an ice core. However, because Iceland was largely unsettled at the time, it would have been difficult for written records to survive. Iceland sits directly on top of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, a divergent plate boundary where 2 tectonic plates are moving away from each other. We know that because there has only been a handful of recorded human history that reached this stratospheric level. They have greatly affected the global climate. For example, the eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991 sent 2 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The gas formed sulfuric acid, which reflected sunlight and lowered global temperatures by 0.5 degrees Celsius for several years, and this can help identify which volcano was responsible. After analyzing their ice cores, the team concluded that the eruption had to have been from a magma chamber that was more than 10 kilometers deep. This eliminated most of the volcanoes in Iceland, except for one, the volcano Eltborg. In total, the stack of eruptions released roughly 1.7 trillion tons of sulfur dioxide. According to a researcher, that's about as much sulfur as all the other large eruptions in the past 2,000 years combined. This fits with historical accounts of poor harvests, disease, and societal collapse across Europe, the Middle East, and China. It caused major changes in climate and weather patterns that disrupted the functioning of both local and long-distance trade networks. With the loss of trade came economic hardship, which likely contributed to the decline of civilizations. Some researchers even believe that the volcanic winter contributed to the fall of the Western Roman Empire just a few years later. And if you liked the video, please leave a comment below and subscribe for more videos in the future. Instead, they point to social and political factors that contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire. Regardless of whether or not you think that darkness had a direct impact on the fall of Rome, it is clear that the volcanic of 544, and 547 AD were unprecedented in their magnitude. Magma from the mantle can easily rise up and erupt on the surface, but the magma chambers that feed Icelandic volcanoes are shallow. For example, the eruptions caused the oldest known ice-free period in Antarctica. Normally, ice sheets cover almost the entire continent. But because of the eruptions, global temperatures dropped so much that the ice melted and exposed a large portion of the land. This allowed marine animals like seals and whales to migrate south and diversify across the continent. Analysis of the ice core samples combined with historical records pointed to the year 540 as the date of the eruption. But according to the geological record, no eruption should have taken place in 540 AD, and that's when things get interesting. Most eruptions consist of lava flows and don't send much ash into the atmosphere. But sometimes the pressure can build up enough to cause an explosive eruption. From the ice cores, they could see that small amounts of sulfate particles were present in the years leading up to 544. And then there was a sudden increase in the amount of radioactive xenon. This meant that the magma chamber beneath Eldberg had been steadily heating up since around the year 540. Then, in 544, the pressure finally built up enough to cause an explosive eruption. The poem, Orstaskatha, was written down around 200 years before Iceland was even settled by humans. This suggests that oral traditions may have passed down stories of the event for hundreds of years before being written down. How significant? Well, the team ran computer simulations to estimate the impact of the eruptions. Their results indicated that the volcanic winter of 544 AD was responsible for the end of the Roman warm period. This was a period of relatively warm temperatures in Europe that allowed the Roman Empire to thrive. Global temperatures fell by 1.2 degrees Celsius, and there were reports of global dimming for more than 2 years. Not only did they find elevated levels of sulfate particles in 544 AD, but also xenon gas. Xenon is normally found deep within the Earth's crust and mantle. When rocks deep underground are heated up by magma, some of the xenon atoms absorb energy and transform into a radioactive form of xenon. This radioactive xenon then decays into iodine and cesium. So, when the rocks are eventually brought up to the surface during an eruption, the presence of these elements can indicate the depth of the magma chamber. So, if an explosive eruption had occurred in Iceland, it could explain the ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica. Sulfate particles are typically emitted during volcanic eruptions. So the team knew they were on the right track. But there was a problem. There are no records of any volcanic eruptions during the year 544. And if there had been one, it should have been recorded somewhere. Right. As far as the scientists could tell, this eruption was completely unknown. Ice cores are formed when layers of snow accumulate and are compacted over time, trapping air bubbles and other particles inside. All the ice cores from Antarctica showed the same spike in sulfate particles, meaning that whatever had happened in 544 AD affected the entire globe. So how could there be no written record of such a massive event? Well, the answer might have to do with how close the eruption site was to where it was recorded. By drilling deep enough, scientists can obtain ice that dates back thousands of years. And that's exactly what this team did. They extracted ice from the year 544 AD and analyzed the chemical composition of the trapped air bubbles. In the northern hemisphere, spring began with unusually high levels of sulfate and nitrate particles. There was also another piece of evidence that didn't quite add up. As the ice core team began their research, another group of scientists was combing through historical records in Iceland. They discovered a poem that mentioned darkness covering the land for so long that people thought the end of times was near. It also mentioned a large fissure opening up on the earth and spewing ash into the sky. Could this have been the mysterious volcanic eruption? Well, the poem dates back to around the year 870, more than 300 years after the supposed eruption. But if the eruption had occurred in Iceland, why did it affect the rest of the world? That's because of the location of the island itself. Explosive eruptions can send ash, gas, and rock high into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and cooling the Earth's surface. The largest recorded eruption in modern history is that of Krakatoa in Indonesia in 1883. Its explosion unleashed 200 billion tons of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. But which volcano? Well, that's where the ice core samples come in. By measuring the ratio of radioactive xenon to stable xenon, scientists can determine how long the rocks were heated before eruption. Eldborg lies beneath the Hurdlefield volcanic system in northwest Iceland. The researchers realized that they were dealing with a series of stacking eruptions, but the eruption didn't stop there. Several smaller eruptions continued to occur in the following years, releasing additional sulfur into the atmosphere. So, while the eruption of Eldborg in 547 AD was the main contributor to the darkness period, the preceding eruptions in 544 and 546 also played a significant role. They found that the darkness period ushered in a new era of cooler temperatures that lasted until around the year 660. According to one researcher, the cumulative effect of multiple volcanic eruptions led to a chain of events that affected society for centuries. However, other researchers disagree with these findings. Some argue that the climatic effect of the eruptions was probably too small to have caused so much devastation, and they were a critical part of Earth's history. Thanks for watching. As the sky darkened, kingdoms crumbled. The year is 249 for the past few decades. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire has been plagued by bad harvests, high taxes, and civil war. Now, as if things couldn't get worse, the emperor's daughter Julia Misa has unleashed an army of poisonous snakes into the audience at the gladiator games. With gladiators dropping left and right from venomous bites, it's clear that the empire is doomed. Just one thing, though, this isn't 249B, this is 1980. What the heck? Has history just started repeating itself? Are we now living through the exact same events that happened almost 2,000 years ago? The Kushan Empire controlled much of northern India and parts of Central Asia. In 220 AD, the war with the Xianbai reached its climax. Well, the answer is both. You see, each of these empires had been experiencing a lot of internal strife. The Eastern Roman Empire was facing economic ruin. Let's go back to the Eastern Roman Empire. Since the beginning of the 3rd century, the empire had been hit by a series of bad harvests. She wasted no time in showing her subjects who was really in charge. There wasn't enough food for the people of Rome, and the result was inevitable: a famine that lasted 3 years and killed millions. The population of the empire was decimated, and those who survived were left weak and vulnerable. The stage was set for the empire's collapse. Because while it may seem like the Byzantine Empire is following the exact same path as the Western Roman Empire, there are some key differences. The fall of Rome was caused by a perfect storm of internal and external factors. And the same can be said for the fall of the Byzantine Empire. But what if history isn't just about falling empires? What if it's also about rising ones? But the similarities between the two empires' falls are more than skin deep. Both empires were weakened by years of war and economic decline. Both were ravaged by famine. And both were ultimately conquered by outside invaders. The Byzantine emperors weren't greedy. They were desperate. They simply had no money, and the taxes that they imposed were necessary to keep the state afloat. The famines that ravaged the empire were the result of natural disasters, not the government's mismanagement. She immediately began seizing property from the wealthy landowners to fund her own projects. Almost 2,000 years later, history seems to be repeating itself. Once again, the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire is facing economic breakdown, political turmoil, and famine. The current emperor Constantine the 11th has been struggling to hold on to power as the Ottomans close in on Constantinople. But like his Roman ancestors, he has little to no food for his people. It's a classic tale of greed, corruption, and decline. And it seems like history is doomed to repeat itself. And when Gordian returned to the city, he agreed with his wife's policies, angering the elite class even further. When Gordian was killed in battle, his widow became the sole ruler of the empire. But her exorbitant spending and heavy taxation led to widespread discontent. By the time the emperor's son came of age and took the throne as Philip the Arab, the empire was in chaos. These food shortages led to riots and rebellions throughout the empire. But Emperor Gordian III came up with a solution. He would confiscate grain from the wealthy landowners and distribute it to the poor. While well-intended, this policy was not very effective, and it angered the landowners who were already suffering from the loss of grain. However, the real trouble began when Gordian went to war with the Persians. The Sasanian Empire was exhausted from years of war. The Kushans were suffering from severe flooding, and the Hans were crippled by a series of famines. The Han general, the great conqueror, was defeated and killed in battle. His head cut off and sent to the Xianbai as a trophy. The Han dynasty would soon collapse, giving way to the Three Kingdoms period. But pressure from nomadic Xiongnu tribes in the north and the Satavahana dynasty in the south led to the collapse of the empire. At the same time, the Han dynasty was being pushed to its limits by internal rebellions and the threat of the nomadic Xiongnu, who had united and taken the name Xianbai. It seems like history sometimes rhymes, but what if it does more than that? What if it also sometimes repeats? From the fall of Rome to the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, some empires have fallen in suspiciously similar ways. Here we see the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire centered around Constantinople, the capital of the Roman world, which today is known as Istanbul and is located in modern-day Turkey. To their east were the Sassanid Persians. To the north were the Goths. And pushing up against the empire from the west were the Franks, the Alemanni, and the other Germanic peoples. The situation was equally fraught with peril in the east for the Sassanians. They too were under pressure from nomadic groups to their north and west. But it was the rise of the Sassanian king Shapur, the first that would lead to a massive showdown between the two empires. But are they really falling in the same way, or is there something else at play? First, let's zoom out and take a look at the entire world map. The Romans had long controlled Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, but it had always been a thorn in the side of the Persian kings who wanted control of the region. After defeating the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, Shapur I seized control of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. Soon after, the Romans were forced to pay tribute to the Sassanids in order to stop the fighting. But the fragile peace didn't last long. By the end of Shapur's reign, Roman Mesopotamia was once again part of the Sassanid Empire. Across the world, the Kushan Empire in India and the Han Dynasty in China were also feeling the heat. Despite these external pressures, the Han fought back. But what exactly caused these empires to fall? Was it the external pressures from neighboring states, or was it something brewing inside the empires themselves? But how did these natural disasters cause the downfall of empires? When the emperor left the city, his wife Julia Misa took over as regent. And while all this was going on, the grain supply in the empire's granaries had dwindled to nothing. But here's where the story takes a bizarre twist. But wait, what if history doesn't repeat itself? What if instead it rhymes? So, while it may seem like history is repeating itself, it's actually rhyming. In the end, the fall of Rome may be a cautionary tale for all empires, a reminder that no matter how powerful or prosperous they may be, they too will one day fall. It was the year 541, and the Roman Empire had seen better days. Corruption was rampant. The economy was in sharp decline, and the Germanic tribes were just beyond the empire's borders, just waiting for it to fall apart so they could pounce. But Rome didn't know that their biggest threat wasn't an army with a bloodlust for conquest or a group of ambitious generals looking to seize the throne. At the time, Emperor Justinian I ruled over the empire from his capital in Constantinople. And by all accounts, he was trying to do a good job. He reconquered much of the lost Western Roman territories, codified Roman law, and set about the task of rebuilding the empire. In Europe, it swept across Italy, Gaul, and Germania. They blamed Jews for poisoning wells and threw them into mass graves. And so they thought that the miasma, or bad air, coming from the rotting corpses was the real killer. So, to avoid infection, the rich bought perfumes and incense to purify the air around them. As for the poor, they did their best to flee the cities and the plague. But wherever the plague went, death followed. Others blamed Christians for making a pact with the devil. And still others blamed women, who, according to legend, were witches. But really, the culprit was microscopic bacteria that made its way from rodents to humans through fleas. Once inside the body, it attacked the lymph nodes, causing buboes to swell up. The victim would then experience fever, weakness, nausea, and vomiting, and then death would come. In the East, it made its way into India and China. The plague traveled everywhere. And at its height, it killed some 5,000 people a day in Constantinople alone. But his dream of a renewed Roman glory was about to turn into a nightmare. But rather an invisible one, something that would bring about their doom in the most horrifying way imaginable. Though the survivors of the plague rebuilt and the Roman Empire endured for 100 years in the West, it was never the same. The plague had changed everything. It reeked of decay and death. Even the sailors handling it seemed sick unto death. The rich and powerful were not immune either. Emperor Justinian himself would contract the plague, though he survived it. Trade routes were disrupted and the amount of goods being traded plummeted. The tax base for the emperor shrank and the military was unable to defend the borders. The Roman Empire was already in decline, but the plague hastened its demise. But the same couldn't be said about his wife, Theodora. In Constantinople, people fled the city in terror as the disease spread north through the empire. By the end of 542, the entire Mediterranean world was infected. And when the merchants and traders traversed the sea routes and made their way to new lands, the plague followed. And as soon as the cargo was unloaded, many of the handlers fell ill and died. Soon, thousands upon thousands in the city were dying, victims of a horrible disease that doctors couldn't cure and didn't understand. A chill wind swept across the Egyptian port city of Gaza as the sun dipped below the horizon. It carried with it the stench of rotting flesh and death. Aboard a ship docked there, a gaggle of soldiers were celebrating their victory over the Persians. But unbeknownst to them, they were sitting atop a coffin, one filled with the souls of the dead and the harbinger of doom. For those souls happened to be infected with bacteria that would go on to infect the soldiers. And the people of Rome, leading to what would become known as the Plague of Justinian. By early 542 AD, the Roman Empire was in chaos. For while the soldiers celebrated in Gaza, a small trading vessel arrived, bringing with it an exotic good, silk. But this silk was different. To make matters worse, nobody knew how to stop its spread. And so the plague continued on to ravage the rest of Egypt. In northern Africa, it ravaged the cities and countryside. And throughout the Roman world, people were utterly terrified. But even that wasn't the worst part. You see, back then, people didn't understand the germ theory of disease. When it was all said and done, historians estimate that between 30 and 50 million people were dead, which is nearly 40% of the population of the Eastern Roman Empire. The immediate effects of the plague led to a sharp decline in population in the Roman Empire, but it also had a profound effect on the economy. And within a century, it would collapse. The Mongol hordes had swept across the Middle East and Central Asia, destroying cities, killing people, and creating huge refugee crises. But while death and destruction were rampant, seeds of new states and new ideas were being sown. At the same time, the Mongols were destroying libraries and killing scholars in cities like Bukhara and Samarkand. Cities like Cordoba and Cairo became hubs of intellectual activity. One of the best-known examples is the Ilkhanate of Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, who ruled much of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. Although the Ilkhanate was founded on conquest, and destruction, it later became one of the most religiously tolerant states in history. It's easy to assume that destruction will simply lead to more destruction. But as we saw in the last episode, societies can adapt to major disruptions, come out of it stronger and more unified than before. Disasters can wipe away old ways of doing things, making it possible to forge new paths forward. This is not to say that they aren't terrible, but rather that they don't always have to mean the end. And it was here that many Muslims first encountered the works of Greek philosophers and scientists that had been preserved in Arabic. Entire nations were transformed in order to fit neatly into one camp or the other. The U.S. helped West Germany rebuild itself into a thriving democracy and economic power, while the Soviets did the same for East Germany. In Latin America, the U.S. supported anti-communist dictatorships in places like Chile and Argentina. Meanwhile, the Soviets provided aid and weapons to revolutionary movements across the globe, from Cuba to Vietnam to Angola, from the devastation of the Black Death to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many of the biggest disasters in human history have felt like the end of everything. Living standards rose dramatically in many parts of the world. Our global economy is so vast and complex that even the most catastrophic event seems unlikely to stop it. Just because something has always been one way does not mean that it will continue to be that way forever. We live in a dynamic world in which conditions change constantly. The societies and systems that we build need to be able to change with them. Without your support, we wouldn't be able to explore these kinds of topics. But perhaps that's the problem. We have grown too comfortable. We have become too accustomed to stability. We have forgotten how to adapt. Millions of people escaped extreme poverty. The world became wealthier than it had ever been before. But globalization has not been without its downsides. Workers in wealthy countries have seen their wages stagnate. Globalization has also exacerbated inequality within countries and between them. The best way to protect ourselves against whatever comes next is to build resilient societies capable of withstanding shocks and continuing to function afterwards. That doesn't mean going back to the Middle Ages or giving up on the modern conveniences that we have come to rely on. It does mean building redundancy into our systems. It means building institutions that are capable of adapting to changing circumstances and finding creative solutions to problems as they arise. While there are more billionaires today than ever before, there's also more extreme poverty. The reality was far more complicated. The US-backed dictatorships were often brutal and repressive, and despite the prosperity they brought to some, poverty and inequality plagued much of Latin America. It was ultimately won by the United States and its capitalist allies. But the differences between the two sides gradually became less and less. Likewise, while the communist states the Soviets backed often did manage to achieve greater equality, it came at the cost of personal freedom and basic human rights. For the first time in history, two deadly weapons of mass destruction had been deployed on civilian targets. The arms race between the superpowers pushed both sides to innovate. New materials were developed. Computers got smaller and more powerful. Rockets were launched into orbit, and eventually man landed on the moon. That was something that would have seemed utterly impossible before the war. Whole cities had been vaporized and millions of civilians killed. Many wondered if humanity could really recover from this. Was this the end of everything? As the United States and Soviet Union emerged from the war as the world's superpowers, they quickly grew tired of competing with one another. Trade and investment flowed more freely around the world. Borders were opened up. Countries became more interconnected economically, socially, and culturally than ever before. The internet connected people across vast distances. International organizations like the UN, World Trade Organization, and International Monetary Fund became more powerful than ever. Each wanted to show the other that their way of life was superior. To the United States, that meant democracy and capitalism. For the USSR, it was communism and authoritarianism. Each side offered the other citizens a vision of the future. And as a result, the world was soon divided. But each of these events also contained the seeds of what would come next, whether that be the early Islamic states, the Renaissance, For starters, the war had killed tens of millions of Europeans, so many that when it ended, European powers didn't have the resources to maintain their empires around the world. Over the next few decades, one by one, they fell apart. By the end of the 1970s, every colony in Africa and Asia was independent, and suddenly the world was full of new states. And Reformation, the Cold War, and decolonization, or the digital revolution and the rise of globalization. They translated these works and built on them, making important advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. As refugees fled Mongol-occupied lands, they carried with them the culture, religion, and technologies of their homelands. This was helped along by the creation of new religious orders dedicated to fighting the Mongols. These orders, like the Mevleviya in Turkey and the Suhrawardiya in Syria and Iraq, helped spread Islam's message across the region and beyond. This is a special edition of the series. I'm your host, and you're watching this channel. Before we jump in, a quick reminder to like and subscribe if you enjoy our content and want to see more of it. He even converted to Christianity himself for a time. The Golden Age lasted only as long as the Ilkhanate did, however. After the empire fractured, the various states that took its place went back to fighting each other and mutual suspicion. Religious tolerance became a thing of the past, and persecution and violence replaced it. But now let's get back to rebuilding after the end. In England, where around 40% of the population died, there was such a shortage of workers that peasants were able to demand higher wages and better working conditions from their feudal lords. When the Mongols sacked and destroyed Moraga in 1220, most of its residents fled to the relatively peaceful city of Baghdad. With them, they brought the scientific and mathematical knowledge that had made Moraga one of the world capitals of astronomy and mathematics. In Baghdad, they shared their knowledge, helping to make it one of the world's leading intellectual centers. It was the beginning of the end for the feudal system in Western Europe. When the Black Death swept through Eurasia in the mid-1300s, it killed between 30 and 60% of the population. It was the deadliest pandemic in history until COVID came along and gave it a run for its money. The Black Death devastated medieval society, causing widespread famine and economic disruption. But it also created space for some dramatic changes. On the other side of the world, the Islamic world was experiencing its own upheaval. One example is the city of Moraga in northwest Iran. That same process repeated itself all over the Islamic world, as refugees fleeing the Mongols enriched cities like Damascus, Cairo, and Cordoba with new ideas. Even more significantly, they synthesized the diverse schools of Islamic thought, which up until that point had been largely separate from one another, into something closer to a single faith. Today, many scholars consider the period of Mongol destruction and subsequent rebuilding to be a high point in Islamic history. A golden age that saw great advances in science, art, and literature. Hulagu Khan invited Christians and Jews from all over his empire to move to his capital at Tabriz, and there they lived together in relative harmony, trading ideas and innovations with Muslims. If there's a lesson to take away from the Mongol example, it's that disasters often have unintended consequences. Sometimes they can feel like it. From the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the destruction caused by the Mongols in the years immediately following World War II. The world looked very different than it had before. Well, no. Instead, it was the beginning of something new. But that wasn't the only change. Millions of people across the world took sides, sometimes violently. Each side claimed that their way of organizing society would bring prosperity, happiness, and peace. Still, the Cold War era saw enormous changes, and not just in politics. It was also a time of great scientific and technological advancement. In the end, the Cold War produced neither the dystopia predicted by its critics nor the utopia envisioned by its supporters. The end of the Cold War in the late 1980s brought yet another set of changes. The world entered an era of unprecedented globalization. Globalization has brought great benefits to billions of people. As we look around us today, it can be hard to imagine anything ending our current way of life. If we are to learn anything from the past, It is that we should never take our prosperity for granted. Whether it's the threat of climate change, a pandemic, or nuclear war, there are plenty of things that threaten to disrupt our way of life. Will humanity be able to do that? Only time will tell. As always, thanks for watching.